Are we doing good morning?
Good morning, Phil.
Good morning.
Back again. Our
Glad
last
to be
lesson in
here.
Abraham.
Last lesson on Abraham. Today's the test.
Yeah.
Today's the test. God tests us. We can feel tested to our limits in a lot of different ways when we're parenting a child
Yeah.
or someone else's child we're taking care of, or if we're balancing a budget, we're trying to navigate a new position at work, or maybe you've got a new job. Life always tests us.
Yeah.
This study tonight, we're looking at Abraham again, and we see that his faith's going to get tested in a pretty severe way.
Big time.
isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know how many of us, if told to do what he did, would pass the test. I just have a feeling that my faith is not as strong as his. When God tests our faith, JR, he doesn't do it in a normal cycle. It seems like he puts us in extreme situations, like he did Abraham here. How do we hold on to our faith and our trust when we're really under some type of a severe test?
Well, a lot of times, Phil, it comes down to the point that we don't have anywhere else to turn when we're tested. And God wants us to depend so heavily on Him that He's the only way that we can see our way through it.
And how do we, and then how do we stay the course when these spiritual tests seem to be just overwhelming to us? And you know this was to Abraham. Let's see how he did. He still needed refining and testing. Evidenced by the fact that he asked Sarah to lie again when they met King Abimelech. He went back to that old standby of her being his sister.
His sister did it again, didn't
So,
a lot had happened, Phil, between the last time we talked about Abraham, what was about a year before Isaac was born, probably, and now Isaac's probably 12 or 13 years old. So a lot had happened during that period of time.
Abram didn't trust the Lord, though, when it came to running into foreign rulers
No.
or going into foreign lands or somewhere strange like that. And God knew it, didn't he? He knows where we fall short. But he held his promises. Isaac was born to Sarah, and he would make his covenant with Abraham and his descendants, Isaac being the one from his own body. And Hagar and Ishmael had to leave when he was weaned, and they had a celebration. The Hagar and Ishmael.
So they were mocking him.
They were scoffing. Yeah.
I guess Ishmael was probably 15 years old at that time, something like that, probably.
Yeah. But Hagar had evidently just pushed Sarah over the edge. And now, after he made them depart, it's time to test his faith again. Let's look at the scripture.
And it says there, the first words in the scripture, chapter 22, verses 1 and 2 of Genesis says, after these things, and this is exactly what you're talking about. Phil, I'm not sure that event of Hagar and Ishmael being pushed out and told to leave the area, I think maybe that was an event that helped sturdy Abraham's faith, because then Ishmael wasn't in the way, and he knew, of course, God had promised Abraham that his offspring would be tremendous, and now Ishmael's out of the picture. I think that helped Abraham's faith too when that event happened, because up to that point he was still hanging around and could have been the one
Well, he told him that he was going to make a great nation out of him.
out of him to Ishmael too.
So,
But anyway, that's where we're at. It says after these times. That's what he's talking about, the things you've talked about there. It says God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, he'd already changed his name to Abraham. We saw that happened in the meantime too. And Isaac was probably about 12 or 13 when this happened, something like that, okay? And he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Now, they're south of Jerusalem, probably about 45 miles, and it takes about 3 days to get to where they were going. And we're going to see how that played out in the next verses. But gosh, God has tested Abraham, not just a little test. Sometimes he tests us, Phil, by saying, you want me to forgive that person? After what they did to me, you want me to forgive them?
yeah.
That's a test we go through sometimes. Or you want me to do what in the church? You want me to utilize what gift? I don't have that gift, but God knows what gifts we have. Or you want me to give how much? Those are some of the tests that we face sometimes. Or you want me to move where? Where do you want me to go? This test puts all of those leaves them in the dust, doesn't it? Of those type things we normally go through. When you say, I want you to sacrifice the only son you have from your wife Sarah.
To us, it seems incredibly
Unbelievable.
outlandish, harsh.
Yep.
You pick a word.
And you said a while ago, you don't know if you could have passed it or not, but when we put the totality of what Abraham had been through up to this point in time and how God had been with him every step of the way, and how at age 100 for him, at age 90 for Sarah, she had actually given birth to this child. And that's what God had told him all along was going to happen. When we believe, we might believe about anything God told us at that time. We're going to see whether Abraham did or not, but he tested him by saying, offer your son as a burnt sacrifice on a mountain I'm going to send you to. And this is probably, most people believe this is probably about the modern day area of Jerusalem, right in that general areas where they went to. If we look at, I'm going to read some verses from James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, where James talks about testing. He says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that we may be mature and complete and lacking nothing. James said, we're going to have testing, and it's going to help our faith. It's going to help us persevere to the end, and we should expect it. And he even says to consider it pure joy when you're tested. You think Abraham considered this statement here from God to be pure joy?
And it had a 3-day journey to think about this. A 3-day journey to think about what he's going to do, what he had to do.
Exactly right. But we're tested too, and James says when we are tested to consider joy. And that's hard for us to do. Let's look at the verses now and see how Abraham reacted to this. He had a choice. Just like you said the last time when he talked about King Elimelech or whatever his name was.
Abimelech. Yeah.
He could have said she's my wife and trusted God to get them through it, but he didn't. He backed up again and said she's my sister. But let's see how he responds to this test that God gives him.
Well, the scripture starts there in verse 3 of chapter 22. It says, so Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abram looked up and saw the places in the distance. Then Abram said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father? And he replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Then the two of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. So, we start there. Regardless of any of the questions that Abraham may have had that were unanswered, he still responded in what way? He got up early in the morning,
the next morning.
and he went about that unpleasant task, the most unpleasant task that he could go about. But he knew God's voice. He knew what he was telling him to do. And he trusted him. Now, I think he trusted him. So he sets out. Wife and I were talking about why when he got to the place where he could see where he was going, did he tell his two young men to stay there? The Bible doesn't tell us, does it? I was just wondering if he would have been tempted to maybe sacrifice one of them instead of his son, or any number of things. They could have stopped him.
I thought they would try to, the three of them could stop him, maybe.
Whatever the reason, he decided to make them stay there. And just imagine the 3 days of travel across there with the only son you got, knowing that
You waited 25 years for, Phil.
Well, you waited your whole life. He's
Yeah.
100, probably.
15 now, something like that.
So it says there a couple of places talked about them walking on after they'd had some brief conversations. What do you think was rolling through Isaac's mind?
We know Isaac at one time wondered what was going on because we asked him about where was the offering. When did he realize that it might be me?
Well, I guess when he tied him
I
up.
know we know he did when he tied him up, but he might have been.
He probably was thinking, what's going on here?
Yeah,
Did he share his faith there with his son?
absolutely. I started to say something about that this was as much a test for Isaac or a must example for Isaac as it was a test for Abraham, wasn't it?
I think it was. He was confident that God was going to return his son to him. He was confident, I think, that he thought God could raise people from the dead. And I think he was confident that whatever God told him to do, he had promised him. This was the child of that promise, that Isaac was going to come through it.
Yeah.
So
Either by being raised from the dead or doing like he did, as we're going to find out later, but he was going to save Isaac from what this ordeal.
it's like that when we go through trials. You hear a lot of noise. You hear a lot of negative things, even in your own mind. These negative things that were rolling around in his mind for these 3 days. We don't know what he thought, but they had to be. He had to be wondering how God's going to do this. And we get in situations sometimes where we wonder how God's going to do this. How is he going to bring me through this?
Yeah.
How is he going to help me prevail? Even when his word promises those things, it's sometimes difficult to know how God will do it. Isaac was old enough to know something was up, something was missing. So he asked him about the lamb. Abraham believed, as we should believe, that God sees everything. and provides as needed.
I think, as I said it earlier, I think Abraham realized exactly how powerful God was and how much faith you should have in God. When Sarah had Isaac at 90 years old, I think that was a capping point of his faith growing to the level that we're seeing it now, was when that happened. Because
And then also Hagar being banned out.
yeah.
Don't worry about her,
Yeah.
he told her.
Yeah, we got, this is the guy, this is a man we're gonna build the world, the Hebrew nation through.
Yeah.
Your son Isaac.
He
And-
didn't know how, but he knew in his
Mm-hmm.
mind that God was going to provide. You just got to know that. And that's where faith comes in a lot of times.
When did we go through times like that 3-day period, Phil?
Well, if we're undergoing medical test and we're sitting there wondering what's this going to show?
If you have a loved one that's not doing well and on the brink of passing away, that's very much akin to what Abraham was facing those 3 days that he walked across that desert going to sacrifice his son.
But even there, you're doing something about it to help your loved one.
Yeah.
Abraham can't do anything
No.
but obey God. And this is the master test.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what's he do? He goes up to this Mount Moriah and he builds this altar. Now that took some time. It took a little time to gather stones. Don't you know he wasn't,
In any hurry?
they were getting heavier and heavier.
Oh, yeah.
As nothing happened.
Yeah.
You know those stones were getting heavier. And he probably built one heck of an altar there. Just because, waiting to see what God was going to do. And then he put the wood on top, just like he'd commanded. And then he binds him. Now, why did he bind him?
Well, it doesn't tell us that Isaac fought back, and we don't know if he did or not, but I think Abraham was probably concerned that he might.
I'd say he probably bound his hands and feet,
Yeah, yeah,
knowing that he probably would fight back and
Well-
try
yeah.
to escape or Pop's lost it. How many times do our kids say that? Dad's lost it. We can't go along with this. You look at this, he did the things necessary to keep him in God's will.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good instruction for us too, is that we do the things necessary with our children to keep them in God's instruction. Then he took his knife out to slaughter him.
Yeah.
And only then, what happened?
The Lord came to him again, this time in the form of an angel, right? It says in verse 11 through 14, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He replied, Here I am. Then he said, Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Now Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. So that is it. So today it is said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Boy, did you think, what did Abraham do when the angel said, Abraham, Abraham?
Well, I'm confused there because he said, it says that the angel of the Lord said, Abraham, Abraham.
Right,
But then he says you didn't withhold your only son from me.
Yeah.
So was it God talking to him, or was it the
That's
angel?
when I read it, I wondered
Or
which.
were they both there together? The angel of the Lord and Abraham too. I don't know.
I don't know, but it God was there, obviously God was there. I don't know if God used the angel to talk about, you not have not withheld your son from me, your only son from me. But Abraham had was relieved. I have a feeling that Abraham fell to his knees and worshiped. And we can't imagine the relief he felt at that point in time. I think, as we talked earlier, this taught Isaac a big teaching point to Isaac, because he saw what his father did, how much faith his father had, and Isaac probably thought, my faith's going to have to be that strong too. Can I do that in my walk with God as my father did?
Yeah.
And our faith is strengthened by people we see go through tests a lot of times, so that when our time comes to go through a test, we can fall back on how we seen other people react, right?
Yeah.
And but gosh, I can't imagine the relief that Abraham felt when God said, "Stop, don't do it."
Yeah. Isn't it amazing, the foreshadowing of Jesus Christ that's throughout these scriptures?
Yeah.
You have Abraham on the 3-day journey. How long was Christ in the grave?
3 days.
You have the sacrifice there that's made on the altar after those 3 days.
And wasn't it just the same? Didn't Abraham, as you've already talked briefly about how he felt those 3 days, he almost felt like Isaac was dead. If you know what you have to do, and you know what the outcome is going to be unless God does something, then you're feeling just like he was already dead.
You remember how in the garden Jesus prayed, said, "Lord, take his cup from me." But then once God didn't answer, what did he do? He went right to it, didn't he? And it's the same way with him.
And we don't have any indication that Isaac wasn't willing. We know Jesus was willing. Jesus said one prayer, once that was over, he willingly went to the cross on his own. They didn't make him, force him to go. He went on his own. How did Jesus get to the cross? What was he doing when he went to the cross?
He was carrying wood.
He was carrying his wood. What is Isaac doing? He's carrying the wood. His dad put the wood on his back, said, "Go to it." So there's so many similarities, but there's one difference. In the very end, did Abraham have to sacrifice his son?
He didn't.
He did not. But we know he probably thought he probably was almost felt like he did those whole 3 days, but he didn't go through the exact thing of sacrificing his son. But we know God did that.
Don't you think the test was to see if Abraham would produce a line that was worthy to be the ancestor of Jesus Christ?
We'll see if he'd raise that knife up. And did God know how it was going to work out?
Sure. He knew how the test would work out.
I was going to say, he knew how the test would work out. Abraham didn't know what the test was going to be. Abraham probably thought, probably believed as much in his heart that he would probably have to kill Isaac and God would raise him from the grave. As he did, he'll stop it before I'd actually do the deed.
You think Isaac had a story for those two guys?
I bet he did.
With the donkey?
When he went back, I bet that trip back was pretty quick, maybe. Unbelievable story, Phil. And it's the beginning of the Hebrew nation. We know that God used them down through history, and a lot of it's because of Abraham's reaction right there. God found somebody that was so faithful that he was willing to give up his own son because God told him to.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of person he needed to lead the Hebrew nation, start the Hebrew nation.
Someone who would trust God even when their faith's going to be tested. It's easier for you and I, we're older, to look back on the track record where God has helped us through trials, through all sorts of problems, you know, and when you look at your life, those things should build us up, and they should be brought to mind. If you can't bring them to mind when you're in the middle of a trial, write them down, and we'll just see God show off His power when He does that. When we do that, we're going to be tested, and we're not going to pass them all. Does that make us?
Makes us stronger.
That's what it
It makes us weak at a time. We're stronger overall, more mature as believers. What if you had to pass a test feeling you didn't have God to fall back on?
Well, you fail miserably.
Yeah.
You fail miserably. Thank God we got Him. Have you ever seen God's prevention or protection? And I know you have. That's why I'm asking you. And mark your track record in your own life.
Yeah.
And we can think back a year.
Yeah.
And
Exactly. Year and a half, 2 years when
yeah.
the car was rolling around in the air, and,
yeah,
you just see God all over it.
Yeah.
And that strengthens your faith. It really does.
it does.
Every time something like that happens, it just strengthens your faith.
And we all have those stories.
Yeah.
We all have stories where God has brought us through something or led us in a direction, and we follow in that direction, and we're rewarded for it. And we need to share those with other people. That's part of our testimony.
Yeah.
And we need to share them. Well, thank you all. We'll never be called on to trust God, and probably in such an extreme act of faith as what Abraham had. But we will be called on him by Him to trust in Him. Sometimes when there's times of testing,
Yep.
and trust Him, and He'll work.
He'll get you through it.
He'll work this.
And of course, a lot of times we think, well, what's in it for me? But a lot of times those tests are for us, to help us and greater glorify His kingdom. We can't always say what is in it for us. And we might not come out of it unscathed, but His kingdom will be better for trial we've been through.
Character building exercises.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Come back next week.